Long before modern maps fixed the edges of the world, before oceans were reduced to blue spaces between continents, the horizon itself was a question. To medieval minds, the sea was not empty. It was alive with danger, mystery, and possibility. It swallowed ships without explanation and returned stories instead of survivors. And yet, there are whispers that some voyagers did not fear that endless blue. They sailed into it deliberately, carrying secrets powerful enough to be erased from history. This is where our story begins, not in a battlefield or a cathedral, but the edge of the known world. At a time when official history insists that Europe looked only east and south, a different narrative quietly emerges. A narrative suggesting that centuries before Columbus, before Magellan, before the age of discovery, the secretive order may have looked west, far west, beyond the limits of accepted geography, across an ocean believed to be impassable, toward islands no European was supposed to know existed. The Knights Templar are usually remembered as warrior monks of the Crusades, bound by vows, clad in white, marked by red crosses. But history has a habit of simplifying what it does not fully understand. Beneath the armor and religious symbolism existed something far more complex. An organization with immense wealth, advanced knowledge, and a reach that extended far beyond medieval Europe. They were bankers, architects, diplomats, and, some believe, custodians of forbidden wisdom inherited from older civilizations. When the Templars were suddenly declared heretics in the early 14th century, their destruction appeared swift and final. Arrests, trials, executions. Their story, according to official records, ended in fire and silence. But silence itself can be suspicious. Entire fleets vanished. Vast treasures were never recovered. And crucially, records that should explain their final years simply do not exist. It is within these missing pages that alternative history begins to breathe. What if the Templars did not merely flee? What if they escaped with purpose? Imagine the tension of that moment. Europe closing in, kings hungry for power, the church eager to erase what it could no longer control. In such a world, survival would not mean hiding in forests or blending into society. It would require distance, absolute distance, not just across borders, but beyond reach, beyond known trade routes, beyond the very map itself. And so the question arises, quietly at first, almost uncomfortably, where could one go to disappear completely? The Atlantic has long been proposed. Scotland, Portugal, even the Americas. But there is another direction, rarely spoken of, rarely entertained. A route so implausible to mainstream historians that it is dismissed before it is examined. The Pacific Ocean. Vast, unforgiving, and for medieval Europe, officially unknown. And at its heart, isolated volcanic islands surrounded by thousands of miles of water. Hawaii. To suggest a medieval European presence in Hawaii is to challenge the foundations of accepted history. It is to imply not only advanced navigation, but intent, planning, knowledge passed quietly between initiates, not written in chronicles meant for kings. It is to suggest that discovery is not always accidental, and that some journeys are never meant to be recorded. Hawaiian oral traditions speak of arrivals from the sea, figures described as different, outsiders, sometimes gods, sometimes teachers. These stories are not framed in European terms, and perhaps that is why they were never connected. Oral history does not fit neatly into archives. It drifts, it changes, it survives in chance and stone rather than ink and parchment. But survival, in any form, is significant. This documentary does not begin with certainty. It begins with unease, with the awareness that history is written by those who remain, not always by those who leave. It asks the listener to suspend disbelief, not to accept every claim, but to question every assumption. Why do certain possibilities provoke ridicule instead of investigation? Why are some questions never pursued, even when evidence, however fragmented, refuses to disappear? The Pacific was not empty. Polynesian navigators crossed it with precision that still astonishes modern scientists. They read stars, waves, birds, and wind in ways Europe would not formally understand for centuries. If such mastery existed in the ancient world, is it truly impossible that others learned different, parallel methods? That knowledge traveled quietly, selectively, guarded like treasure. The Templars were not ordinary men of their time. They operated outside feudal norms, answered to no king, and accumulated knowledge wherever they went. In the Middle East, they encountered Islamic scholars, ancient texts, and sciences preserved from Greece, Rome, and perhaps far older sources. Knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and navigation flowed through these encounters. What was learned did not always return to Europe openly. As the listener settles into this story, the aim is not to shout revelation, but to whisper possibility, to allow the idea to unfold slowly, like a ship appearing on the horizon at dawn. First indistinct, then undeniable in shape. The idea that Hawaii, far from being an untouched paradise awaiting modern discovery, may have been known, visited, and deliberately concealed. If this were true, the implications would be enormous. It would mean that global contact occurred not as a chaotic accident of the Renaissance, but as a controlled, selective process centuries earlier. It would mean that some knowledge was deemed too dangerous, too destabilizing to survive the political and religious upheavals of Europe. And it would mean that the ocean, rather than separating worlds, connected them far earlier than we are taught. This opening chapter is not about proof. It is about orientation, about turning the mind toward the horizon and allowing it to linger there. The sea does not give up its secrets easily. It erases tracks, corrodes evidence, and rewards patience over certainty, but also remembers. In currents, in stones carried across islands, in stories that refuse to die. Tonight, as this story unfolds, you are invited to drift with it, to move slowly, deliberately, away from the noise of modern certainty and into the quiet tension of unanswered questions. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a forbidden journey may have begun, one that history chose not to remember, but never fully forgot. To understand how the Knights Templar could even be connected to a journey as improbable as a trans-Pacific crossing, one must first strip away the familiar image of armored horsemen and battlefield crusaders. That image, repeated endlessly in textbooks and popular media, tells only a fraction of the story. Behind the swords and red crosses existed something far more unusual for the medieval world. An organization that functioned as a multinational corporation, an intelligence network, a financial system, and a repository of advanced knowledge, all rolled into one. The Templars emerged during a time when Europe was fragmented, largely illiterate, and technologically behind the civilizations it encountered in the East. Yet within a few generations, this small band of knights transformed into the most powerful and wealthy order in Christendom. Such a transformation did not happen by chance, nor could it be sustained by warfare alone. It required information, accurate, timely, and often secret. From the very beginning, the Templars were different. They answered directly to the Pope, bypassing kings and local authorities. This singular privilege allowed them to move freely across borders, establish commanderies in distant lands, and operate under a veil of autonomy that no other order enjoyed. They built networks that stretched from England to Jerusalem, from the Iberian Peninsula to the edges of Eastern Europe. Along these routes flowed not only golden pilgrims, but knowledge. Their role as bankers is well documented. Pilgrims could deposit money in one city and withdraw it thousands of miles away, an innovation centuries ahead of its time. But banking requires record-keeping, encryption, trust systems, and logistical precision. These same skills translate seamlessly into navigation, cartography, and long-distance planning. The Templars were administrators of complexity in an age that feared it. What is discussed far less often is their maritime power. The Templars maintained fleets, ports, and shipyards, particularly along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. The port of La Rochelle in France stands out as one of their most important naval hubs. When the order was abruptly suppressed in 1307, It was from this port that a significant number of Templar ships vanished. Never seized, never accounted for, never recorded as destroyed. Ships do not simply disappear. Not fleets. Not without intent. Medieval ships were expensive, slow to build, and required trained crews. If the Templars lost their ships, someone would have claimed them. If they were destroyed, records would exist. The silence surrounding their fate suggests something else entirely: departure. A planned exodus carried out swiftly before royal forces could intervene. Navigation in the medieval period is often underestimated. While it is true that Europe lagged behind in some maritime technologies, it is also true that knowledge flowed from Islamic, Chinese, and ancient sources into the hands of those willing to learn. The Templars were uniquely positioned to absorb this knowledge. In the Levant, they encountered Arab astronomers, mathematicians, and navigators whose understanding of the stars far surpassed that of Western Europe. Star charts, astrolabes, and mathematical models of the Earth were not unknown to them. In fact, some historians argue that such tools reached Europe earlier than officially acknowledged, precisely through secretive channels like the military orders. Knowledge that threatened religious doctrine or political control was often restricted, shared only among elites or initiates. Maps, too, played a crucial role. Medieval maps were not always meant to represent physical reality. Many were symbolic, theological, or deliberately distorted. But alongside these existed portolan charts, remarkably accurate navigational maps showing coastlines, ports, and distances. Some of these charts display anomalies. Coastlines too precise, land masses appearing where none should have been known. Who commissioned these maps? Who could afford their creation? And who benefited from their secrecy? The Templars, with their wealth and global reach, fit this profile precisely. A secretive order does not advertise its discoveries. It encodes them. It hides them in symbols, in geometry, in routes passed orally rather than written down. Knowledge becomes power only when others lack it. There's also the question of motivation. Why would the Templars invest in maritime exploration beyond known trade routes? The answer may lie in their dual identity as both religious and pragmatic. Their faith taught them that the world was God's creation, vast and filled with meaning. Their pragmatism taught them that survival required foresight. If political winds turned hostile, as they eventually did, escape routes would be essential. The sea offered what land never could: anonymity. Borders dissolve on water. Authority weakens. Control becomes a matter of skill rather than decree. A ship answering to no king, guided by stars rather than roads, is the ultimate symbol of independence. Some theories suggest that the Templars inherited ancient seafaring knowledge, perhaps Phoenician, perhaps even older. The Phoenicians were master navigators of the ancient world, capable of crossing vast distances long before the Roman Empire. If fragments of this knowledge survived into the medieval period, they would not have circulated openly. They would have been guarded, tested, and entrusted only to those deemed worthy. The Templars were obsessed with continuity, with preserving something through chaos. Whether that something was the Holy Grail, sacred relics, forbidden texts, or simply the order itself remains debated. But preservation implies foresight, and foresight implies planning beyond immediate horizons. As this section closes, the listener is left with a revised image of the Knights Templar, not as relics of a violent past, but as architects of hidden systems. Men who understood that power is not always exercised openly, and that the most important journeys are those that leave no trace. If such men were forced to vanish, they would not scatter randomly. They would follow maps others could not read, guided by stars others did not understand, toward destinations others did not even know existed. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the world of the Knights Templar collapsed without warning. Across France, and soon throughout much of Europe, Templar Knights were arrested in coordinated raids ordered by King Philip IV. The charges were severe: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and yet strangely vague. Confessions were extracted under torture. Trials were rushed. Fires were lit. And in the official record, the story appears to end there. but endings written in haste often hide beginnings. What is rarely emphasized is just how sudden and unnatural this collapse was. The Templars had operated openly for nearly 2 centuries. They were respected, feared, and deeply integrated into European society. If they were truly guilty of the crimes alleged, why had no one noticed earlier? Why did accusations surface only when the French crown was deeply in debt to the order? These questions linger like smoke after a fire, difficult to grasp, impossible to ignore. The Purge of 1307 was not merely an attack on individuals. It was an attempt to erase a system. Yet systems rarely vanish overnight. They adapt. They fragment. They migrate. As arrests spread, a curious pattern emerged. In some regions, particularly outside of France, local authorities hesitated. In Portugal, Scotland, and parts of Spain, the Templars were treated with suspicion but not the same brutality. Some were absorbed into new orders. Others simply disappeared from the record. Disappearance, in historical terms, is often more telling than execution. Even more mysterious is what happened to the Templars' material wealth. The order had accumulated vast resources: gold, silver, land, ships, documents, and relics. When royal agents seized Templar properties, they found far less than expected. Treasuries were empty, vaults bare, records incomplete. It was as if the order had anticipated its own destruction. Nowhere is this absence more striking than at the ports. At La Rochelle, one of the Templars' most important naval bases, royal forces arrived to seize ships and found none. Contemporary accounts speak of entire fleets missing. No battles were reported, no wreckage discovered, no official explanations offered. Ships capable of crossing oceans had simply vanished into the open sea. This silence is one of the most unsettling aspects of the Templar story. Medieval chroniclers were not shy about recording disasters. Shipwrecks, storms, naval defeats, all were meticulously noted. Yet in this case, there is nothing, not even rumor, only absence. What happened in the years immediately following the Purge remains one of the greatest blank spaces in medieval history. The surviving records focus on trials and executions, but they say little about movement, logistics, or escape. And yet escape would have required all three. Consider the timing. The arrests were planned in secret, but secrecy is rarely perfect. The Templars were deeply embedded in European society. They had allies, informants, and networks of communication. It is entirely plausible that warnings reached them before the hammer fell. Even a few weeks' notice would have been enough. If escape was planned, it would have had to be swift and decisive. Not toward neighboring lands where royal authority still held sway, but toward regions beyond immediate reach. The Atlantic offers one possibility, the Mediterranean another. But the Pacific, vast, remote, and beyond the imagination of most European rulers, offered something else entirely: erasure. To flee across such distances would require more than desperation. It would require preparation. Ships provisioned for long voyages. Crews trained to navigate unknown waters. Knowledge of routes not marked on public maps. And perhaps most importantly, a destination chosen in advance. History tells us that after 1307, the Templars ceased to exist. But that conclusion rests on a narrow definition of existence. Organizations do not vanish simply because they are outlawed. They change names. They fragment into cells. They pass knowledge quietly rather than publicly. There are persistent legends of Templars finding refuge in Scotland, fighting alongside Robert the Bruce, or influencing the formation of later secret societies. Whether or not these claims are true, they point to a deeper truth: the idea that the Templars did not accept annihilation passively. What is striking is how aggressively later institutions worked to control the narrative. Records were destroyed, properties reassigned. The order was formally dissolved by papal decree, as if paperwork alone could end centuries of accumulated power and knowledge. This insistence on finality feels almost offensive. Why the need to declare the Templars completely erased? Why not allow them to fade quietly into obscurity? Perhaps because something had escaped. In the centuries that followed, Europe entered an age of exploration that officially began in the late 15th century. Suddenly, knowledge of long-distance navigation, global wind patterns, and new lands emerged with surprising speed. Some historians attribute this to technological innovation. Others point to accumulated experience. But rarely is the possibility considered that such knowledge had existed earlier, preserved in secret, waiting for a safer time. If the Templars carried with them maps, charts, or experiential knowledge of distant oceans, it would explain both the speed of later discoveries and the reluctance to acknowledge earlier ones. Admitting that medieval explorers crossed the Pacific would undermine carefully constructed narratives of progress and supremacy. The lost years after 1307 are not empty because nothing happened. They are empty because what happened did not fit the story later generations wanted to tell. As this section closes, the listener is left with an unsettling possibility that the destruction of the Templars was not the end of their journey, but the moment it truly began. That under cover of persecution, an ancient order may have slipped quietly into the world's largest ocean, carrying with it secrets still buried beneath layers of water, time, and silence. Maps are often treated as neutral tools, simple reflections of what people knew at a given time. But throughout history, maps have also been instruments of power, secrecy, and intention. They reveal only what their makers wish to reveal, and they conceal just as much. When it comes to the possibility of a pre-Columbian journey across the Pacific, maps become more than illustrations. They become silent witnesses. Official history maintains that medieval Europe possessed only a vague, mythical understanding of the world beyond the edges of the known continents. Oceans were thought to be endless voids, populated by monsters and leading nowhere. And yet, scattered across archives and collections are maps from the Middle Ages that quietly contradict this narrative. Maps that display knowledge far too precise, far too confident, to be the product of guesswork alone. Among these are the Portolan charts, highly accurate nautical maps that appeared suddenly in the 13th century with no clear developmental history. Unlike symbolic medieval mappamundi, Portolan charts focus on coastlines, harbors, and sailing distances. Their precision is startling. Coastlines of the Mediterranean and Atlantic are rendered with an accuracy that would not officially be replicated for centuries. The question that has long troubled historians is simple. Where did this knowledge come from? Portolan charts do not show their sources. They do not explain themselves. They simply appear, fully formed, as if copied from something older. Some of these charts contain anomalies, subtle distortions, unexplained land masses, or coastlines that do not correspond to any officially known geography of the time. In certain cases, land appears west of Europe where none should exist according to medieval understanding. These features are often dismissed as artistic flourishes or errors, yet they recur with uncomfortable consistency. It is important to understand that medieval mapmakers were not ignorant craftsmen guessing at the world's shape. They worked with data, sailing times, compass bearings, star positions, collected by sailors who had actually traveled these routes. When something appears on a nautical chart, it usually reflects lived experience, not imagination. The Pacific, however, presents a unique problem. It is vast beyond comprehension, and yet it is not empty. Polynesian navigators crossed it for centuries using sophisticated methods that modern science still struggles to fully explain. They did not rely on written maps, but on mental ones, star paths memorized across generations. If such mastery existed in the ancient world, the idea that others learned from it becomes less far-fetched. Some researchers suggest that fragments of Pacific knowledge may have reached the Old World through indirect contact, Arab traders, Chinese explorers, or lost maritime cultures. The Knights Templar, positioned at crossroads of trade and conquest, would have been ideally placed to absorb such information quietly. There is also the matter of projection. Certain medieval maps appear to represent the world using mathematical principles that imply an understanding of the Earth as a sphere with measurable circumference. This knowledge officially re-enters European consciousness during the Renaissance, but its earlier presence raises uncomfortable questions. Accurate projection is difficult without long-distance observational data. Then there are maps that should not exist at all. Maps like the controversial Pyrie Reese chart, created in the early 16th century but allegedly based on much older sources. While often associated with the Americas, such maps demonstrate a pattern. Knowledge appearing suddenly, explained away as coincidence, and then absorbed into accepted history without scrutiny of its origins. If earlier sources existed, who guarded them? Who copied them? Who decided what parts would be shared and what parts would remain hidden? Secretive organizations do not leave obvious signatures. They encode information, fragment it, distribute it selectively. A coastline drawn slightly out of place. An island misnamed. A route hinted at but never fully explained. To the untrained eye, such details mean nothing. To those who know, they are invitations. The idea of a Pacific route existing in medieval times is often rejected not because evidence is absent, but because it is inconvenient. It disrupts a linear narrative of progress. It suggests that history does not move cleanly forward, but loops, forgets, and remembers selectively. Maps, especially those created under the influence of powerful institutions, are political documents. They reflect what is allowed to be known. If the Templars or similar groups possessed knowledge of distant lands, knowledge gained at great risk, they would have little incentive to publish it, especially if that knowledge offered refuge beyond the reach of hostile powers. In this light, the absence of clear Pacific routes on medieval maps becomes suspicious rather than reassuring. Why carefully chart coastlines up to a point and then suddenly stop? Why leave blank spaces where sailors had every incentive to explore further? Perhaps because some journeys were not meant to be repeated widely. As this section draws to a close, the listener is invited to see maps not as static artifacts, but as layered texts. Documents written in ink, silence, and omission. If a hidden Templar journey across the Pacific did occur, it would not announce itself boldly. It would survive in distortions, in anomalies, in maps that almost, but not quite, tell the whole story. The horizon, once again, becomes a boundary not of knowledge, but of permission. To imagine a medieval voyage across unknown oceans is to confront a modern misconception. That navigation in the past was crude, uncertain, and guided largely by superstition. In reality, navigation was a sophisticated blend of observation, mathematics, memory, and tradition. For groups like the Knights Templar, who existed at the intersection of faith, science, and secrecy, navigation was not merely a practical skill. It was a sacred art. The Templars lived in a world where the heavens were believed to reflect divine order. The movement of stars, the geometry of the earth, and the proportions found in nature were not random. They were expressions of a cosmic design. To understand these patterns was, in a sense, to read the language of God. This worldview shaped how the Templars built their churches, planned their fortresses, and, potentially, how they found their way across vast distances. Sacred geometry was central to Templar philosophy. Circles, squares, triangles, and ratios such as those later known as the Golden Mean appear repeatedly in Templar architecture. The Temple Church in London, modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, is circular for a reason. Geometry, to the Templars, was not decorative, it was functional. It encoded knowledge that could be transmitted silently, without written explanation. This same geometric mindset could be applied to navigation. The Earth itself is a sphere, and once this is understood, movement across it becomes a matter of angles, arcs, and relationships between points. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon Greek astronomical knowledge for centuries, and the Templars encountered this learning firsthand in the Middle East. Concepts such as latitude, stellar declination, and celestial measurement were known in scholarly circles long before they became common in Europe. Navigation by stars was not guesswork. It required precise observation and long-term familiarity with the night sky. Certain stars rise and set at predictable angles, depending on one's position on the Earth. By measuring these angles, Using instruments like the astrolabe or even simpler shadow-based tools, a navigator could determine latitude with surprising accuracy. The North Star, Polaris, served as a fixed point in the northern hemisphere, but beyond a certain latitude it becomes less useful. To navigate farther south or west, one must rely on other stars, constellations, and patterns. Polynesian navigators mastered this art, memorizing entire star paths, sequences of rising and setting stars that guided them across the Pacific. These are not written down, but passed orally through disciplined training. The idea that the Templars might have learned or independently developed similar techniques is not as implausible as it seems. Knowledge of the stars was widespread among scholars, monks, and travelers. What distinguished the Templars was their ability to preserve and apply such knowledge in practical, high-stakes contexts. Secrecy was essential. Written manuals could be seized, misinterpreted, or destroyed. Oral transmission, symbolic encoding, and ritualized teaching were safer. A lesson disguised as a prayer. A diagram hidden in a floor pattern. A star chart embedded in architecture. These methods ensured that knowledge survived even when institutions fell. There's also evidence that the Templars were interested in ley lines, natural alignments believed to connect sacred sites across the landscape. Whether one interprets ley lines as mystical energy paths or simply as ancient travel routes aligned with celestial events, the concept reflects an awareness of spatial relationships on a grand scale. To navigate along such alignments is to move in harmony with the Earth's geometry. At sea, this harmony becomes even more critical. Wind patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal cycles form invisible highways across the water. Modern science recognizes predictable currents such as the North Pacific Gyre, which circulates clockwise and could theoretically carry vessels westward from the Americas toward Asia or the Pacific Islands. Knowledge of such currents does not require satellites, only observation, experience, and patience. If the Templars possessed even partial understanding of these patterns, they would have been able to plan routes that minimized risk. Long voyages are not undertaken blindly. They are staged, tested, refined. Each journey adds to a growing body of experiential knowledge. Critics often argue that medieval ships were incapable of surviving such voyages. But this argument underestimates both ship design and human adaptability. Ships used by the Templars were robust, built for long-distance transport of pilgrims and goods. They were not flimsy coastal craft. With proper provisioning and seamanship, they could endure far more than commonly assumed. More importantly, navigation is not solely about technology. It is about mindset. To sail beyond the known world requires confidence, not reckless confidence, but informed conviction. A belief that the world continues beyond the horizon and that it can be measured, understood, and crossed. This belief separates explorers from drifters, and the Templars were not drifters. Their entire existence was structured around discipline, hierarchy, and long-term objectives. If a decision was made to venture into unknown seas, it would have been done with deliberation, preparation, and secrecy. Routes would have been chosen not only for feasibility, but for concealment. As this section comes to rest, the listener is invited to reconsider what navigation truly meant in the medieval world. It was not merely a technical skill. It was a synthesis of science, spirituality, and survival. For an order that believed the universe itself was structured according to divine geometry, following the stars across the sea would not have seemed reckless. It would have felt inevitable. When we speak of Hawaii in conventional history, we are taught to imagine isolation, volcanic islands rising from the Pacific, settled by Polynesian navigators, and remaining untouched by the outside world until European contact in the late 18th century. This narrative is clean, orderly, and reassuring. But like many clean narratives, it may be incomplete. Beneath it lies a deeper question, one that unsettles historians and fascinates seekers of hidden history alike. Was Hawaii truly unknown, or was it known and deliberately forgotten? Long before the name Hawaii was written on European maps, The islands already existed within an intricate web of Pacific navigation. Polynesians did not stumble upon them by accident. They reached them intentionally, using star paths, ocean swells, cloud formations, and bird behavior with astonishing precision. This alone should give pause to the idea that Hawaii was impossibly remote or unreachable. If Polynesian voyagers could locate and return to these islands repeatedly, then Hawaii was not lost in the ocean. It was part of a navigational system. But systems invite interaction. Hawaiian oral traditions speak of arrivals from the sea that do not fit neatly into known Polynesian migrations. Legends describe strangers with different appearances, different tools, and unfamiliar customs. These figures are sometimes described as teachers, sometimes as gods, sometimes simply as visitors who came and went. Oral history, unlike written history, does not prioritize dates or linear timelines. It preserves meaning rather than chronology. And meaning, in this case, suggests contact. There are chants that speak of canoes larger than any local vessel, of sails unlike those woven from native fibers, stories of metal tools appearing suddenly, of stoneworking techniques that seem to arrive fully formed. Mainstream scholarship often explains these elements as metaphor, coincidence, or later contamination. But such explanations assume contamination is always more likely than contact. Hawaii's geographical position makes it uniquely suited as a sanctuary. It sits far from continental power centers, surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean. For anyone seeking not just refuge, but disappearance, it is almost ideal. Unlike continents with competing kingdoms and shifting borders, Hawaii offered isolation without desolation. Fresh water, fertile land, and a sophisticated indigenous society capable of sustaining newcomers, all without the reach of European authority. If an organization like the Knights Templar were searching for a place beyond the grasp of kings and popes, Hawaii would meet every requirement. It was distant enough to vanish into, yet navigable enough to reach for those who knew how. Its isolation was not a barrier, it was protection. What makes this idea particularly uncomfortable for traditional historians is that it implies intention. Hawaii would not have been stumbled upon accidentally by Europeans drifting across the Pacific. It would have required prior knowledge, knowledge of its existence, approximate location, and environmental viability. Such knowledge could only come from earlier explorers, shared quietly, selectively, and guarded carefully. Here, silence becomes evidence. European records do not mention Hawaii until much later, but absence from records does not equal absence from awareness. Medieval institutions were highly selective about what they documented. Information that threatened political stability, religious authority, or economic control was often suppressed or destroyed. A hidden destination used by a persecuted order would certainly qualify. There is also the issue of naming. Names change when places are rediscovered, renamed, or rebranded. If Hawaii existed in earlier European or Near Eastern knowledge under a different name, or as part of a loosely defined island chain, it could easily slip through the cracks of modern classification. Cartographers might obscure it deliberately or encode it symbolically rather than geographically. Consider how many islands were mislocated on early maps, shifted hundreds of miles from their true position. This was not always error. Sometimes it was concealment. A map that reveals too much invites pursuit. Archaeological mysteries within Hawaii itself further complicate the picture. Certain stone structures, alignments, and platforms do not fit comfortably within known Polynesian architectural traditions. While mainstream archaeology often attributes these to local variation or ceremonial purposes, alternative interpretations suggest foreign influence, techniques introduced rather than evolved. These interpretations are controversial, and rightly so. But controversy does not invalidate inquiry. It highlights unresolved questions. If foreign visitors did arrive in Hawaii centuries before official contact, they would not have come as conquerors. Conquest leaves unmistakable traces: violence, displacement, radical cultural rupture. What we see instead in Hawaiian history is continuity. This suggests that any outsiders who arrived integrated quietly, respected local authority, or remained separate altogether. Such behavior would align with a group seeking refuge rather than dominion. The idea of Hawaii as a hidden destination also reframes Polynesian history. Rather than portraying Pacific cultures as isolated or passive, it positions them as central participants in a global story, keepers of knowledge, hosts to travelers, and navigators of a vast interconnected oceanic world. In this view, Hawaii is not the edge of the world, but its crossroads. As this section settles, the listener is invited to sit with an unsettling thought that Hawaii's greatest mystery may not be who found it, but who chose not to speak of it. That the islands were not forgotten by accident, but protected by silence. And in that silence, across centuries of waves and wind, a hidden destination may have waited, known to a few, invisible to many, and absent only from the stories we were told to believe. Stone remembers what people forget. Long after names fade and stories blur, stone remains silent, immovable, and patient. Across the Hawaiian Islands, there are stones that do not easily explain themselves. Structures that sit quietly in the landscape, often dismissed, sometimes ignored, yet stubbornly present. For those willing to look closely, these stones raise questions that ripple far beyond the islands themselves. Mainstream archaeology presents Hawaii as a place of remarkable indigenous engineering. Fish ponds, heiau temples, terraced agriculture, and ceremonial platforms demonstrate deep knowledge of stonework and environmental harmony. This is undisputed, but alongside these well-documented structures exist anomalies, forms, alignments, and construction techniques that do not fit neatly into established categories. Some of these sites feature stone platforms built with a precision that appears unusual for purely ceremonial use. Stones are stacked in ways that suggest defensive thinking rather than ritual display. Walls are thick, angular, and strategically positioned. In certain locations, these formations resemble old-world fortifications more than Polynesian temples. This resemblance alone does not prove foreign influence, but it invites comparison. Then there are the crosses. Scattered reports describe cross-like symbols carved into stone, etched into lava rock, or formed through deliberate stone placement. Critics argue that such shapes are universal, that humans naturally create intersecting lines. And this is true, but context matters. Some of these crosses appear in isolation, away from known ceremonial centers, and lack clear explanation within Hawaiian symbolic tradition. More intriguing still are crosses that appear alongside symbols resembling rope knots, circles, or eight-pointed star forms, shapes that bear resemblance to medieval European iconography, including symbols associated with the Knights Templar. The eight-pointed star, for example, appears in multiple cultures, but also held specific meaning within Crusader orders, representing balance, renewal, and divine order. Skeptics often dismiss these findings as coincidence, erosion, or misinterpretation. Yet coincidence becomes less convincing when patterns repeat. Another category of unexplained structures involves stone alignments. Certain formations appear to track solar or stellar events, solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of particular stars. Polynesian astronomy is well established, and Hawaiian priests were keen observers of the heavens. However, some alignments correspond to celestial markers that are more prominent or meaningful in Old World traditions than in Polynesian cosmology. This raises a delicate question. Could multiple astronomical traditions have coexisted on the islands? If foreign visitors arrived and stayed for extended periods, they would have brought their own cosmological frameworks. Over time, these frameworks could blend subtly with local traditions, leaving behind traces that later generations interpreted differently or forgot entirely. There is also the matter of construction technique. Some stonework features tightly fitted blocks without mortar, reminiscent of megalithic traditions found in places as distant as Peru, Malta, and parts of the Mediterranean. While independent invention is always possible, The recurrence of similar techniques across distant cultures continues to puzzle archaeologists. The idea that a foreign group, Templar or otherwise, might have contributed to or influenced certain structures in Hawaii is controversial, and understandably so. It challenges deeply held assumptions about cultural development and isolation. But controversy should not shut down inquiry. It should sharpen it. If such a group arrived seeking secrecy, they would not build grand cathedrals or monuments announcing their presence. They would build quietly, functionally, using local materials, adapting their techniques to unfamiliar environments. Any symbols they left behind would be subtle, coded, easily overlooked by those not trained to see them. This is precisely what makes these structures so difficult to interpret. They do not scream foreign origin. They whisper it. Adding to the mystery is the way some sites are treated today. Certain locations are restricted, poorly studied, or quickly reclassified under broad cultural explanations without detailed investigation. While this may stem from respect for indigenous heritage, it can also result in unanswered questions being set aside indefinitely. The line between preservation and avoidance is thin. It is important to stress that exploring alternative interpretations does not diminish Hawaiian culture. On the contrary, it situates Hawaii within a larger human story, one of movement, exchange, and shared curiosity. It recognizes the islands not as passive endpoints, but as active participants in a world connected by water long before modern globalization. If foreign travelers did arrive, they would have encountered a society deeply attuned to land, sky, and sea. Cooperation would have been far more likely than conflict. Knowledge exchanged quietly. Techniques shared without conquest. Symbols blended rather than imposed. Over generations, memory fades. Structures remain, but their origins blur. A wall becomes ancient. A carving becomes ceremonial. The question of who built it and why becomes secondary to its continued presence. As this section settles into silence, the listener is left standing among stones warmed by centuries of sun, stones that have seen arrivals and departures, prayers spoken in languages now lost, and intentions never written down. Whether these stones bear witness to a hidden Templar presence or simply to the vast complexity of human history, they remind us of one enduring truth. The past is not as simple as we are taught, and sometimes it is written not in books, but in stone. To understand why the Knights Templar might have risked everything on a journey beyond the known world, one must look beyond geography and into purpose. Empires expand for land. Merchants travel for profit. But the Templars were driven by something far less tangible and far more dangerous: guardianship. They did not merely seek territory. They sought preservation. At the heart of the Templar mystery lies the idea of the Grail, not merely as a physical object, but as a symbol of sacred knowledge, divine authority, and continuity beyond collapse. Over centuries, the Grail has been interpreted as a cup, a stone, a bloodline, a set of teachings, or even a state of enlightenment. What matters is not which interpretation is correct, but that the Templars were believed, by both allies and enemies, to be its protectors. This belief alone made them dangerous. In medieval Europe, power flowed from legitimacy. Kings ruled by divine right, sanctioned by the Church. If an order possessed knowledge or relics that challenged that authority, proof of alternative succession, hidden teachings, or contradictions within doctrine, it would represent an existential threat. The destruction of the Templars was not simply about wealth. It was about control over meaning. When the order fell, the question was not only where the Templars went, but what they carried with them. If the Grail, or whatever the Templars believed it to be, was real in any sense, it could not remain in Europe. Europe was no longer safe. Archives were being seized, monasteries raided, confessions extracted under torture. The environment was hostile not just to people, but to ideas. Preservation, therefore, required radical distance. The Pacific Ocean represents the ultimate separation. It is not merely far, it is psychologically distant. For medieval Europe, the Pacific might as well have been the edge of existence. No armies could follow. No papal edicts could reach. No inquisitors would arrive unannounced. Beyond that ocean lay silence. Hawaii, in this context, transforms from a geographic curiosity into a sanctuary. Its isolation is not accidental. It is strategic. Surrounded by thousands of miles of open water, it is one of the most difficult inhabited places on Earth to reach without advanced knowledge. This difficulty is precisely what makes it ideal for hiding something meant to endure. The Templars were planners. Their fortresses were built with layers of defense. Their financial systems were designed to survive instability. Their rituals emphasized continuity across generations. It is entirely consistent with their character that they would seek not a temporary refuge, but a long-term solution, one that could outlast political regimes and religious upheavals. The Grail, in many traditions, is associated with transformation rather than possession. It is not something to be used openly, but something to be protected until the world is ready. If this was the Templars' belief, then hiding it was not cowardice, it was responsibility. There is also the possibility that what the Templars sought to preserve was not a single object, but a lineage of knowledge. Texts, oral teachings, cosmological understanding, or spiritual practices inherited from earlier civilizations. Such knowledge would be fragile in times of persecution. Fire destroys books. Torture silences voices. Distance, however, protects. A remote island society, rich in oral tradition and spiritual cosmology, would be uniquely suited to such preservation. Hawaiian culture placed immense value on genealogy, chant, and the transmission of sacred knowledge through memory rather than writing. In such an environment, teachings could survive without ever being committed to parchment. This raises an intriguing possibility that the Grail tradition did not disappear, but transformed. That it was not hidden in a vault, but woven into stories, rituals, and symbols that later generations no longer recognized as foreign. Critics argue that such a journey would have been too risky, too uncertain. But risk is relative. For an order facing total annihilation, staying in Europe was the greater danger. The Pacific, though vast, offered something Europe no longer could: time. Time to wait. Time to adapt. Time for history to forget. It is also worth considering the psychological dimension. The Templars were steeped in biblical and mystical symbolism. The idea of crossing a great sea to reach a promised or protected land would not have seemed strange to them. It would have resonated deeply. Exodus, exile, sanctuary. These themes run through their spiritual worldview. In this sense, a journey to the farthest reaches of the world would not have been seen as abandonment, but as fulfillment. The Grail beyond Jerusalem is a powerful idea because it reframes the end of the Templars not as defeat, but as transition. The Holy Land was lost. Europe turned hostile. The center shifted. Sacred geography is not fixed. It moves with those who carry its meaning. As this section draws to a close, the listener is invited to consider a quieter form of heroism. Not conquest, not martyrdom, but preservation. The willingness to disappear so that something greater might survive. To carry a sacred trust beyond the reach of history itself. If the Templars did risk the Pacific, they did so not for glory, but for silence. And in that silence, somewhere far from cathedrals and crowns, the Grail, whatever it truly was, may have found a place to rest. The Pacific Ocean was never an empty void. Long before European ships learned to trust open water, Polynesian navigators crossed immense distances with confidence and precision. They did not stumble blindly across the sea. They traveled along routes memorized through generations, guided by stars, waves, winds, birds, and clouds. To them, the ocean was not a barrier, it was a map. This understanding is essential because it reframes what contact in the Pacific might have looked like. If foreign sailors reached these waters, they would not have encountered isolation, but expertise. They would have met people who knew the ocean far better than they did. The idea of an encounter between Polynesian navigators and Templar sailors challenges deeply ingrained assumptions. It suggests a meeting not of conqueror and conquered, but of specialists. Two maritime cultures, each possessing knowledge the other lacked, brought together by circumstance and survival rather than ambition. Polynesian navigation relied on what modern researchers call wayfinding. This was not guesswork or intuition, but a disciplined system of environmental observation. Navigators memorized star paths, specific sequences of stars rising and setting along particular bearings. They learned to read the direction and rhythm of ocean swells, which remain consistent over vast distances. They observed the flight patterns of birds that feed at sea but roost on land, using them as indicators of nearby islands. Such skills were taught orally, often within tightly controlled lineages. Knowledge was power, and not everyone was entrusted with it. This parallels the Templar approach to knowledge remarkably well. The Templars, too, restricted access to certain teachings, transmitting them through initiation rather than publication. If a group of Templar sailors found themselves in Polynesian waters, whether by design or through guided contact, they would have encountered a navigational system that complemented their own. Where European methods relied heavily on celestial instruments and geometry, Polynesian methods integrated sensory perception and lived experience. Together, these approaches could form an exceptionally robust understanding of the sea. The nature of any such encounter would likely have been cautious. Both cultures valued discipline and hierarchy. Both respected knowledge earned through training rather than inherited status. There is no reason to assume hostility. Trade, exchange, and mutual assistance are far more consistent with the archaeological and oral evidence than conflict. Hawaiian legends speak of visitors who arrived by sea and did not remain permanently. These figures are often described as knowledgeable, sometimes revered, sometimes mysterious. They are not remembered as invaders, but as presences, people who came, interacted, and left impressions without domination. This is significant. Violent contact leaves scars that persist in memory. Peaceful exchange often fades quietly into myth. If Templar sailors did arrive in Hawaiian waters, they would have been outsiders in every sense, physically, culturally, linguistically. Survival would have required cooperation. Polynesian societies were not naive or defenseless. They would have evaluated newcomers carefully, integrating them only to the extent that trust was earned. Such integration might explain subtle cultural resonances, shared symbols, architectural parallels, or navigational concepts that appear without clear origin. Over time, these influences would blend into local traditions, stripped of their foreign context. Language, too, offers intriguing hints. While no direct linguistic link has been established, some researchers note similarities in nautical terminology across distant cultures. This is not evidence in itself, but it suggests the possibility of shared conceptual frameworks. The sea encourages convergence. Problems faced by sailors are universal, and solutions often echo one another. Critics rightly caution against overinterpretation. Humans are adept at finding patterns where none exist. Yet dismissal can be as dangerous as credulity. When multiple independent lines of inquiry, oral tradition, navigational capability, symbolic parallels point in the same direction, they deserve careful consideration. One of the most compelling aspects of this theory is its humility. It does not center Europe as the sole source of knowledge. Instead, it acknowledges Polynesians as equal, if not superior, masters of the ocean. In this narrative, Europeans do not discover Hawaii. They arrive as guests, perhaps even as students. This inversion of the traditional discovery narrative is uncomfortable but revealing. It forces a reconsideration of who holds expertise and how history assigns credit. If the Templars learned from Polynesian navigators, that knowledge would have been invaluable and guarded. Such knowledge would not appear in European records. It would be too powerful, too destabilizing. Better to let it vanish into silence than allow it to reshape worldviews prematurely. As this section settles into quiet reflection, the listener is invited to imagine a night at sea centuries ago. Stars overhead, waves breathing beneath the hull. Two traditions of navigation meeting without words, united by the shared language of the ocean. No flags raised, no chronicles written, just knowledge exchanged briefly before each path continued on its own course. In that moment, two worlds may have touched, and then slipped back into the vastness of the Pacific, leaving only whispers behind. Symbols travel more easily than people. They slip across borders, survive centuries, and adapt to new cultures while retaining echoes of their origins. Unlike written language, symbols do not require translation. They speak through shape, proportion, and placement. And when similar symbols appear in distant lands with no officially recognized connection, they invite questions that are difficult to silence. Across the Hawaiian Islands, there exist markings and motifs that do not fit comfortably within known Polynesian symbolic systems. Some are subtle, etched into stone, arranged in patterns, or embedded in architectural layouts. Others are more striking, bearing resemblance to symbols long associated with medieval Europe and, in particular, with the Knights Templar. The cross is the most obvious and the most controversial of these symbols. Critics are quick to point out that crosses are universal shapes, appearing independently in many cultures. This is true, but universality does not eliminate meaning. It complicates it. The significance of a cross lies not only in its form, but in its context, orientation, and association with other symbols. Some cross-like carvings in Hawaii are not aligned with traditional Polynesian cosmology. They do not correspond to known ceremonial directions or solar events commonly emphasized in indigenous practice. Instead, they appear isolated or paired with motifs that suggest intentional marking rather than ritual decoration. More intriguing are crosses that resemble the equal-armed or eight-pointed cross, forms strongly associated with Crusader orders, including the Templars. The eight-pointed cross symbolized balance, regeneration, and cosmic order. It was not merely a religious emblem, but a geometric one, rooted in sacred mathematics. Alongside these crosses appear knot-like symbols, interwoven loops carved or implied through stone placement. Knot symbolism held deep meaning in medieval Europe, representing eternity, binding oaths, and hidden continuity. The Templars, as an order bound by vows, would have found such symbolism particularly resonant. In Polynesian culture, knots also appear, though often in different contexts: navigation, fishing, or the genealogy. The overlap here is subtle but compelling. When similar symbolic language appears across cultures separated by vast oceans, the question becomes not whether one influenced the other, but how. Symbols do not need to be imposed to survive. They can be shared, adapted, or quietly embedded within local traditions. A visiting group seeking discretion would not carve overt declarations of identity. They would use forms that could blend into existing symbolic landscapes while retaining layered meaning for those who knew how to read them. Placement matters as much as shape. Some markings appear near coastal areas, elevated vantage points, or locations aligned with celestial events. These are places of orientation, point from which land, sea, and sky intersect. Such locations would be significant to navigators, not just priests. There are also reports of symbols etched into lava rock in ways that suggest deliberate effort rather than casual marking. Lava rock is not easy to carve. Doing so requires tools, time, and intent. These are not idle gestures. Skeptics often argue that such symbols could be the result of later European contact. But this explanation does not always hold. Some markings are found in locations that predate known European arrival or in contexts that show long-term weathering inconsistent with recent origin. More importantly, later European visitors had little incentive to leave subtle, coded symbols in remote areas. Colonizers left flags, churches, and records. They marked territory openly. What we see here is something else entirely. Hidden markings suggest hidden presence. The study of symbols is inherently uncomfortable because it resists certainty. Symbols are designed to be ambiguous. They reveal themselves differently depending on who is looking. This makes them easy to dismiss and difficult to prove, but also incredibly resilient. If the Templars or a related group did arrive in Hawaii, symbols would have been their safest form of expression. Symbols can survive without explanation. They can be ignored without being destroyed. They can wait. Over time, meaning erodes. A symbol becomes decoration. A marker becomes a curiosity. Eventually, it becomes invisible. This process does not erase the past. It conceals it. It is also worth considering that symbols may not have been left to communicate outwardly, but inwardly, to mark safe places, to orient future travelers, to signal that a location held significance known only to a select few. In this sense, symbols function as memory anchors. They do not tell a story outright, but they preserve the possibility of one. They ensure that if someone, someday, knows how to look, the past can be reassembled. As this section settles, the listener is invited to imagine symbols not as static relics, but as quiet messengers. Shapes carved in stone, waiting centuries for recognition. Not demanding belief, only attention. Across oceans and generations, symbols cross where people cannot. And sometimes, they're all that remains of journeys never meant to be remembered. History is often imagined as a complete record, carefully preserved and passed down through time. But in reality, history is selective. It is shaped not only by what is recorded, but by what is omitted, destroyed, or quietly ignored. Archives, far from being neutral repositories of truth, are products of power, and silence within them can be as deliberate as any written decree. When it comes to the Knights Templar and the possibility of a journey far beyond Europe, the silence is profound. The medieval world was not careless with documentation. Monasteries kept detailed chronicles. Royal administrations recorded finances, decrees, and correspondence. The Church maintained vast archives of theological, legal, and historical material. For an order as influential as the Templars, one would expect an abundance of records detailing their final years, movements, and dissolution. Instead, we encounter gaps, sudden endings, missing explanations. This absence is often explained away as lost due to time, war, or decay. And certainly, some records were destroyed unintentionally. But not all loss is accidental. Some erasure is systematic. After the Templar Purge, there was a strong incentive for both secular and religious authorities to control the narrative. The charges against the order were severe but flimsy. Heresy, secret rituals, and idol worship were difficult to substantiate and even harder to explain convincingly. The fastest way to prevent scrutiny was to eliminate context. Documents that might portray the Templars as explorers, scholars, or custodians of alternative knowledge would have complicated the story. They would have raised uncomfortable questions about motive. Was the order truly corrupt or simply inconvenient? Did it possess knowledge that threatened existing hierarchies? In such cases, silence becomes a solution. The Vatican archives, among the most extensive in the world, remain largely inaccessible. While some Templar-related documents have been released, many remain sealed or heavily restricted. This fuels speculation, but more importantly, it reinforces the idea that not everything is meant to be known. Even outside religious archives, secular records are strangely quiet. Maritime logs are missing. Port records show inconsistencies. Fleets disappear without explanation. In an age where shipping was expensive and dangerous, such omissions are difficult to justify. It is worth remembering that history is not written by the curious. It is written by the survivors. After the fall of the Templars, those with the power to write history were often the very institutions that benefited from their destruction. The French crown seized assets. Rival orders inherited properties. The Church reasserted doctrinal authority. In this context, acknowledging that the Templars escaped, regrouped, or continued their mission elsewhere would undermine the legitimacy of their condemnation. It would suggest that the purge failed, that something slipped through, and so the story ends abruptly, not because nothing happened, but because what happened could not be safely explained. The same pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. When knowledge threatens established power structures, it is labeled dangerous, heretical, or irrelevant. It is not debated, it is buried. Libraries are burned. Texts are lost. Traditions are dismissed as myth. Alternative histories suffer not because they are inherently false, but because they lack institutional support. Without official endorsement, they are relegated to the margins, where they survive in fragments, oral traditions, local legends, unexplained artifacts. The possibility of a Templar journey across the Pacific would challenge multiple foundational narratives. It would complicate the idea of European discovery. It would suggest that global contact occurred earlier, more quietly, and without imperial ambition. It would elevate indigenous navigational knowledge while diminishing European exceptionalism. Such implications are not merely academic. They reshape identity, authority, and ownership of the past. This helps explain why even modern academia often treats such theories with discomfort rather than curiosity. Careers are built on consensus. Funding follows accepted frameworks. To seriously investigate a hypothesis that threatens long-established timelines is to risk professional isolation. Thus, silence perpetuates itself. What remains are whispers, inconsistencies, footnotes that lead nowhere, references to documents that no longer exist, mentions of voyages without destinations. These fragments are not proof, but they are signals that something was once there. Silence is also a form of control. By limiting what is discussed, institutions shape what is imaginable. If a Pacific crossing by medieval Europeans is deemed impossible, it is rarely explored. Evidence that might support it is interpreted through other lenses or dismissed outright. Yet impossibility is a moving target. What once seemed unthinkable, ancient transoceanic travel, advanced prehistoric astronomy, complex indigenous engineering, has repeatedly been reconsidered in light of new discoveries. Each time, the past grows more complex. The silence surrounding the Templars may one day be viewed in the same way. As this section draws to a close, the listener is invited to reflect on absence, on blank spaces and timelines, on questions that are never asked because they lead too far from comfort. History does not always lie, but it often withholds. And sometimes, the most important stories are not written at all. When physical evidence grows faint, history often retreats into the human body itself. Bloodlines, genetics, and inherited traits become the final archives, living records that persist long after documents are burned and stones erode. If the Knights Templar or related groups reached distant shores and remained there, even briefly, the most enduring trace of their presence would not be symbols or structures, but people. This idea is among the most controversial and also the most unsettling. Throughout Hawaiian history, there have been recurring observations that sit uncomfortably outside standard explanations. Early European explorers recorded encounters with islanders whose appearance, stature, or features did not align neatly with Polynesian norms. Such accounts are often dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding, and in many cases, that dismissal is justified. Human diversity is broad, and perception is subjective. Yet patterns matter. Some Hawaiian oral traditions speak of alii, chiefly lineages, whose origins were described as unusual or sacred. These lineages were sometimes said to descend from outsiders who arrived by sea, individuals endowed with special knowledge or authority. In Polynesian culture, genealogy is not merely ancestry, it is legitimacy. To claim descent from a powerful outsider was to claim a connection to something beyond the ordinary. If foreign individuals integrated into Hawaiian society, they would not have done so randomly. They would have been absorbed selectively, likely into elite or priestly classes. This is consistent with how Polynesian societies incorporated outsiders, through marriage, adoption, and ritual inclusion rather than conquest. Over generations, physical differences would fade, but cultural memory could persist. The idea of European bloodlines in Hawaii before official contact is often treated as taboo, largely because it threatens two narratives at once: the isolation of Polynesia and the timeline of European expansion. But acknowledging the possibility does not diminish Hawaiian culture. It emphasizes its openness, resilience, and ability to integrate without losing identity. There are also whispers, never formally substantiated, yet persistent, of genetic anomalies. Traits such as lighter hair, unusual eye colors, or atypical bone structures have been noted in certain families. These observations alone prove nothing. Genetics is complex, and such traits can arise independently. But when combined with oral tradition and other anomalies, they invite cautious inquiry. Modern genetic studies have revealed surprising results in other parts of the world. South American populations with Polynesian genetic markers. Ancient migrations previously thought impossible. Human history, it turns out, is far more fluid than once believed. Movement across oceans occurred earlier, more frequently, and in more directions than textbooks once allowed. If Polynesians reached South America, if Africans reached Asia, if ancient mariners circled continents long before the modern era, then the idea of limited European presence in the Pacific becomes less radical. What makes the Templar hypothesis distinct is not just movement, but secrecy. If the Templars integrated into distant societies, they would not have preserved their identity openly. Survival would have required adaptation. Names would change, beliefs would blend. Children would grow up belonging fully to their new culture. Over time, only echoes would remain. Some traditions speak of guardians, figures tasked with protecting sacred knowledge, sites, or practices. These guardianship roles were often hereditary, passed down through specific lineages. The function mattered more than the origin. If foreign knowledge needed to survive, embedding it within lineage would be the safest method. This mirrors Templar structure closely. The order emphasized continuity across generations, not through blood, but through initiation. Yet, bloodlines offer a different kind of continuity, one that cannot be confiscated or outlawed. It is also worth considering how history treats lineage when it is inconvenient. Claims of alternative ancestry are often dismissed as myth or romanticism. But myth is not falsehood. It is memory shaped by time. It encodes truth in symbolic form, preserving meaning when details are lost. Stories of ancestors arriving from the sea, carrying sacred objects or teachings, may not be literal in every detail, but they may point to real events remembered imperfectly. The resistance to exploring such possibilities stems partly from fear of misuse. History has been weaponized before, used to justify domination or erasure. But refusing to investigate does not prevent misuse. It merely leaves the past incomplete. A careful, respectful approach recognizes that integration does not equal ownership. If Templars or other outsiders left descendants in Hawaii, those descendants are Hawaiian. Culture is not diluted by ancestry. It is defined by belonging. As this section settles, the listener is invited to reflect on the idea that history lives on in people, that the past is not only buried beneath stone or hidden in archives, but carried quietly within families, traditions, and bodies. If the Templars did leave more than stones behind, their greatest legacy may not be artifacts waiting to be discovered, but lives already lived, stories already told, though few remember where they truly began. And in that sense, the mystery is not distant at all. It is human. To imagine the final voyage of the Knights Templar is to step into a moment suspended between collapse and rebirth. Europe was no longer safe. The order that had once operated openly now faced extinction. Arrests spread like wildfire. Confessions were forced. Fires burned in public squares. And somewhere, far from the eyes of kings and inquisitors, a different decision was being made, not to surrender, but to depart. This voyage would not have been an act of desperation alone. It would have been calculated, prepared, and executed with precision. The Templars did nothing impulsively. Their survival depended on planning that began long before the first arrest. The departure likely began at the coast, under cover of night. Ports like La Rochelle were not random locations. They were strategic hubs equipped with ships, crews, and access to open water. Ships loaded not with merchandise, but with what mattered most: people, knowledge, portable wealth, and whatever sacred items the order believed must not fall into hostile hands. The ships themselves would have been robust, designed for endurance rather than speed. Medieval vessels are often underestimated, but they were capable of long-distance travel when properly managed. With seasoned sailors, careful provisioning, and favorable seasonal winds, survival at sea was possible even without modern instruments. From the Atlantic, the route becomes speculative, but not unimaginable. One possibility is a southern passage, following known trade routes along the African coast, then rounding the continent into the Indian Ocean. Arab and African sailors had been navigating these waters for centuries. Monsoon winds offered predictable seasonal movement, allowing ships to travel vast distances with relative efficiency. From there, access to Southeast Asia and the Pacific becomes plausible. This route would have placed the Templars in contact with maritime cultures already familiar with long ocean crossings. Knowledge exchange here would have been invaluable. Routes, currents, island chains. Information shared quietly could open doors that maps alone could not. Another possibility involves a westward Atlantic crossing, followed by navigation along the American coastline and eventual entry into the Pacific. While more controversial, this route aligns with evidence suggesting pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. If landfall was made, the journey could continue gradually, using coastal navigation to minimize risk. In either case, the journey would not have been direct. It would have unfolded in stages, pauses for resupply, repairs, and reconnaissance. Islands and coastlines would serve as waypoints, not destinations. Each leg of the voyage would test assumptions, refine routes, and build confidence. The Pacific itself would have been the greatest challenge. But the Pacific is not uniformly hostile. It contains patterns, currents that loop predictably, winds that shift seasonally, island chains that serve as stepping stones across open water. Polynesian navigators understood this intimately. Their success was not accidental, it was systematic. If the Templars reached a point where Polynesian knowledge could be accessed, whether through direct encounter or inherited routes, the final crossing becomes far more achievable. Guidance from those who knew the ocean would transform uncertainty into navigation. The emotional weight of the voyage cannot be ignored. These were not explorers seeking fame. They were exiles, men leaving behind familiar lands, languages, and identities. Some would never return. Faith, discipline, and belief in a greater purpose would have been essential. Night after night at sea, the stars would become companions. The same stars used for navigation would also serve as reminders of order in a world that had turned chaotic. Sacred geometry in motion. Heaven mirrored on water. Storms would come. Ships would creak and strain. Doubt would surface, but so would resolve. Turning back was not an option. The past was closed. Only forward remained. As weeks turned into months, the crew would begin to understand that survival required adaptation. European habits would give way to new rhythms dictated by the ocean. Food rationing, watch rotations, silence broken only by wind and waves. Then land. The first sighting of an island after prolonged open water is an experience that defies description. A dark shape on the horizon, clouds behaving strangely, birds appearing where none should be. These signs would have been unmistakable to seasoned sailors. Arrival would not mean triumph. It would mean caution. Unknown shores demand humility. The Templars would observe before acting. Who lived here? Was it inhabited? Friendly? Dangerous? Contact would be deliberate, respectful. Survival depended on cooperation, not dominance. If Hawaii was the destination, or one of several, it would have offered everything required to begin again quietly. Fresh water, fertile land, a society capable of integration. Most importantly, distance. Distance not just from Europe, but from history itself. This reconstructed voyage is not offered as certainty, but as possibility grounded in capability. Every element, ships, knowledge, motivation, routes, exists independently in history. Combined, they form a scenario that is not impossible, only unacknowledged. As this section settles, the listener is invited to imagine the final moments of the crossing. Anchors dropped, sails lowered, feet touching unfamiliar ground. No banners raised, no declarations made, only survival. The last voyage of the Templars would not have ended with conquest or celebration. It would have ended with silence. And in that silence, a hidden chapter of history may have begun. Far from Europe, far from memory, but never entirely beyond reach. At this point in the journey, the question can no longer be avoided. Too many fragments have aligned. Too many silences echo the same absence. Too many possibilities refuse to remain hypothetical. And so the story reaches its turning point, not with certainty, but with synthesis. What if the Knights Templar reached Hawaii first? Not as conquerors, not as discoverers in the modern sense, but as refugees, custodians, and witnesses, men who crossed the largest ocean on Earth not to claim it, but to disappear into it. To ask this question is not to declare it true. It is to recognize that history, as it is commonly taught, is not the only framework through which the past can be understood. When we assemble the elements, Templar maritime capability, vanished fleets, advanced navigation, anomalous maps, Polynesian expertise, Hawaiian oral traditions, unexplained structures, shared symbolism, and archival silence, we do not arrive at proof. But we do arrive at coherence. And coherence matters. Mainstream history often demands direct evidence. A document, a date, a signature. But such evidence rarely survives moments of deliberate erasure. When power feels threatened, it does not argue. It removes. What remains afterward are shadows, patterns, echoes that must be interpreted rather than read. The possibility that the Templars reached Hawaii reframes one of the most deeply ingrained myths of Western history, the myth of discovery. It suggests that discovery is not a single moment, but a process, one that can be reversed, concealed, or forgotten. It implies that the world was interconnected earlier than we are comfortable admitting, and that some connections were deliberately hidden. If medieval Europeans reached the Pacific centuries before official exploration, it would mean that global awareness did not expand in a straight line. It expanded, contracted, and expanded again. Knowledge was gained, then lost. Or more precisely, protected. This challenges the idea that history naturally progresses toward enlightenment. Instead, it suggests that history is cyclical. Civilizations rise, accumulate knowledge, collapse, and pass fragments forward, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. In this view, the Templars become less of an anomaly and more of a pattern. They were not the first to safeguard knowledge, nor the last. Throughout history, groups have emerged at moments of transition, when old systems fail and new ones have not yet stabilized. These groups act as bridges. They carry ideas, practices, and values across the gaps. The Pacific, long portrayed as a barrier, becomes the ultimate bridge, not because it is easy to cross, but because it is hard. Hardness filters intent. Only those with reason, preparation, and resolve attempt such journeys. If Hawaii was known to a select few long before Captain Cook, then its later discovery becomes something else entirely, rediscovery. A moment when a place long present in human awareness was reintroduced into a historical narrative that had forgotten it. This would explain the lack of shock in some early accounts, the familiarity, the ease with which Europeans eventually navigated these waters. It would also explain why certain questions were never asked. To ask them would be to unravel the timeline. There's also a deeper implication, one that moves beyond dates and voyages. If the Templars reached Hawaii, then the collapse of their order was not total. It was transformational. Their mission did not end. It changed form. Instead of operating publicly, they dissolved into the fabric of another world. Their identity became secondary to their purpose. This idea unsettles because it removes closure. We like our historical villains and heroes neatly resolved, executed, victorious, defeated. But survival in obscurity is harder to categorize. It blurs lines. It resists judgment. It also forces a reevaluation of Hawaiian history, not as an isolated narrative, but as part of a global human story. This does not diminish Polynesian achievement. On the contrary, it elevates it. It acknowledges that Polynesian societies were not merely recipients of contact, but arbiters of it. They chose what to absorb and what to reject. In this version of history, Hawaii is not a forgotten corner of the world. It is a sanctuary, a place where knowledge could rest without being consumed by power struggles. A place where memory could be preserved in chant, ritual, and lineage rather than in vulnerable ink. The great revelation, then, is not that the Templars reached Hawaii. It is that history itself is more fragile, more selective, and more intentional than we are taught. That what survives is not always what mattered most, only what was allowed to remain visible. This realization changes how we read the past. It encourages humility. It reminds us that absence is not emptiness, that silence is not ignorance, that sometimes the most important truths are not missing. They're hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right questions. As this section draws to a close, the listener is invited to sit with the weight of possibility, to imagine a world where the Pacific was crossed in secret, where the end of one order marked the beginning of another chapter far from Europe, where history did not end in flames, but continued quietly beneath unfamiliar stars. If the Templars reached Hawaii first, then the horizon we have been staring at since the beginning of this story was never empty. It was simply misunderstood, and perhaps, even now, it still is. If the possibility of a hidden Templar journey to Hawaii is allowed to exist, even briefly, even hypothetically, it forces a profound reckoning, not just with dates and maps, but with how history itself is constructed, controlled, and taught. This is the point where the mystery stops being about the past alone and begins to touch the present. History is not merely a record of what happened. It is a framework through which societies understand themselves. It tells us who discovered whom, who led and who followed, who possessed knowledge and who waited to receive it. These narratives shape identity, authority, and power. When one of them is disturbed, the consequences ripple outward. If medieval Europeans crossed the Pacific before the age of official exploration, then the story of discovery collapses under its own weight. Discovery implies first contact, surprise, and novelty. But what if the world had already been quietly connected, then disconnected, long before Columbus sailed west? In that case, modern history would not represent humanity's first global awakening, but its second. This idea challenges the comforting belief that progress is linear. We are taught that humanity moves steadily from ignorance to enlightenment, from superstition to science. But alternative history suggests something far more complex. Cycles of knowledge gained, lost, hidden, and rediscovered. Civilizations rise, accumulate understanding, then fall, leaving fragments behind for others to inherit. The Templars fit neatly into this pattern. They appear suddenly in history, rise with astonishing speed, accumulate power and knowledge, and then vanish just as abruptly. The official explanation treats this as an anomaly. But anomalies often indicate deeper structures we do not yet understand. If their disappearance involved intentional withdrawal rather than destruction, then the narrative of medieval Europe must be re-examined. The fall of the Templars would no longer represent the triumph of orthodoxy over heresy, but the failure of power to fully control what it feared. This brings us to the question of suppression. Institutions do not suppress ideas because they are false. They suppress them because they are dangerous. Dangerous to authority, to legitimacy, to social order. A history that acknowledges early global contact undermines claims of cultural superiority. It weakens the moral justification for conquest. It reframes colonialism not as heroic expansion, but as delayed intrusion into already interconnected worlds. If Polynesian navigators mastered the Pacific long before Europe mastered the Atlantic, then the hierarchy of exploration collapses. If Hawaiians encountered outsiders centuries before official contact and chose how to engage with them, then indigenous peoples are no longer passive recipients of history. They are active agents within it. This shift is deeply unsettling to traditional historical power structures. It also forces a reconsideration of secrecy itself. In modern culture, secrecy is often viewed negatively, associated with deception or conspiracy. But in earlier eras, secrecy was survival. Knowledge could be dangerous. Certain truths could destabilize societies not yet prepared to integrate them. Hiding knowledge was not always about control. Sometimes it was about preservation. If the Templars carried knowledge across the world and concealed it intentionally, they may have believed they were acting responsibly, waiting for a future where such knowledge could emerge without triggering destruction. This raises uncomfortable questions about our own time. Are there truths today that are hidden not because they are false, but because we are not ready to confront them? Does progress require forgetting as much as remembering? Identity, too, becomes fluid under this lens. European identity has long been built around narratives of exploration and dominance. Indigenous identity has often been framed as static, isolated, and reactive. A hidden history of mutual contact disrupts both views. It suggests that cultures have always been in dialogue, even when that dialogue was quiet. For Hawaii, this perspective is particularly powerful. It situates the islands not as the end of the world, but as a node within it. A place chosen, not stumbled upon. A sanctuary rather than a footnote. Importantly, acknowledging alternative history does not mean rejecting scholarship or embracing fantasy. It means accepting uncertainty. It means allowing questions to exist without demanding immediate closure. It means recognizing that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when absence itself may be the result of deliberate erasure. Modern academia struggles with this balance. It thrives on proof, replication, and consensus. Yet history is not a laboratory science. It is an interpretive discipline, reliant on fragments, context, and human judgment. When too much weight is placed on certainty, curiosity suffers. This is why alternative histories often survive outside institutions. Not because they are inherently correct, but because they are allowed to ask forbidden questions. They explore the spaces where official narratives end. Of course, this freedom carries responsibility. Not every mystery hides a truth. Not every coincidence is meaningful. Discernment matters, but dismissal is not discernment. True inquiry requires patience, humility, and openness to being wrong. If the Templars reached Hawaii, it would not rewrite history overnight. It would not suddenly invalidate centuries of scholarship, but it would invite revision. And revision is the lifeblood of understanding. More broadly, it would remind us that history is not owned, not by nations, churches, or institutions. It belongs to humanity. And humanity's story is messy, nonlinear, and often uncomfortable. The power of this mystery lies not in proving a single journey, but in revealing how fragile our historical certainties really are. How much depends on what survives, who controls interpretation, and which voices are amplified or silenced. In the end, perhaps the most radical implication is this: that the world has always been more connected than we are taught to believe. That separation is often an illusion created by distance and time, not space. And that the oceans, rather than dividing us, have always been pathways, sometimes open, sometimes hidden. As this section settles into reflection, the listener is left with a sense of unease and possibility. Unease because the past may not be as settled as it seems. Possibility because understanding that past differently opens new ways of seeing the present. If history can be rewritten, even slightly, then identity is not fixed. Power is not absolute, and the horizon, once again, becomes an invitation, not to conquer, but to question. The story is no longer just about the Templars or Hawaii. It is about how we choose to remember, and what we are willing to reconsider when the familiar narrative begins to crack. The mystery of the Holy Grail has captivated human imagination for centuries, intertwining with the legacy of the Knights Templar in ways that have sparked legends, myths, and endless speculation. The Templars' association with the Grail is one of the most enduring and influential aspects of their story. Although there is no definitive historical evidence to suggest that the Templars ever possessed the Grail, the very idea of their connection to this ancient artifact has inspired a wealth of theories and tales. The Grail, as both a literal and symbolic object, represents something much larger than mere material wealth. It stands for enlightenment, divine favor, and hidden knowledge. The Templars' involvement in the Crusades, their religious zeal, and their mysterious, secretive nature have all contributed to the enduring belief that they may have been guardians of the Holy Grail, an object of immense spiritual power that continues to be shrouded in mystery. The Holy Grail, often depicted as the cup used by Jesus Christ during the Last Supper, has been the subject of countless stories and interpretations. In Christian tradition, the Grail is said to hold great sacred significance, with some believing it contains the blood of Christ or possesses miraculous powers. Over the centuries, the Grail has become a symbol of divine grace, purity, and the quest for spiritual transcendence. The Templars, as devout knights sworn to protect the Christian faith, are believed by some to have been entrusted with guarding this sacred artifact. The idea that the Grail was hidden or protected by the Templars has been perpetuated through a combination of historical speculation, mythological traditions, and esoteric teachings, each adding layers to the mystery of the Grail's true nature and its connection to the Templars. The link between the Templars and the Holy Grail was popularized in part by the literature of the Middle Ages, particularly through the cycle of Arthurian legends. In these stories, the Grail is often depicted as a mystical object that knights embark on a quest to find. The Knights Templar, with their martial prowess, religious devotion, and dedication to a higher cause, have often been cast as the ideal protectors of the Grail. While the Arthurian legends themselves do not directly reference the Templars, who did not exist in their current form during the time of King Arthur, the symbolic connections between the Templars and the Grail began to develop in the minds of later generations. The Templars, in this mythic framework, became the perfect custodians of the Grail, standing as guardians of a divine mystery that could change the course of history. The idea that the Templars may have discovered the Holy Grail during the Crusades is rooted in the fact that the order spent nearly 2 centuries in the Holy Land, particularly in Jerusalem, where they established strongholds and conducted military operations in the name of Christianity. Some theorists claim that the Templars, during their time in Jerusalem, uncovered hidden knowledge or sacred relics associated with early Christianity, including the Grail. These relics, which may have been lost or hidden for centuries, would have been of immense value, both spiritually and materially. The Templars, as protectors of Jerusalem and the Christian pilgrimage routes, would have had access to sacred sites that were believed to contain profound secrets that might include the Grail itself. One of the most compelling theories connecting the Templars to the Holy Grail involves the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of the ancient Jewish Temple of Solomon. According to some accounts, the Templars, while stationed at the Temple Mount, discovered ancient Jewish writings, sacred scrolls, or hidden relics beneath the ruins of the temple. Some speculate that the Grail may have been one of these hidden artifacts, buried deep beneath the earth for safekeeping. This theory is bolstered by the fact that the Templars took their name from the Temple of Solomon, and their role as protectors of Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem was deeply intertwined with the sacred history of the city. The idea that the Templars could have uncovered such powerful relics fits with their mystique as an order of knightly scholars, bound by an oath to protect not just the physical safety of pilgrims, but the sacred knowledge associated with the Holy Land. The quest for the Holy Grail, as portrayed in both the Templars' time and in later literary and mythological traditions, is often seen as a spiritual journey rather than a material pursuit. The Grail represents the ultimate goal of divine enlightenment, a connection to the divine that transcends earthly concerns. The Templars, with their religious mission and their oath of secrecy, are often depicted as seekers of this higher knowledge. For the Templars, the Grail might have been a symbol of the ultimate truth, the key to understanding the mysteries of the universe and humanity's place within it. In this sense, the Templars' role as guardians of the Grail would have been not just a matter of protecting a physical object, but of safeguarding spiritual wisdom that could unlock the deepest secrets of creation. This notion of the Templars as guardians of secret knowledge is further fueled by the fact that the Order's rituals and practices were shrouded in mystery. The Templars were known for their secretive initiation rites, which involved symbolic gestures, cryptic languages, and oaths of silence. Some have speculated that these rituals were designed to impart deeper, esoteric wisdom to the initiates, wisdom that was somehow linked to the Holy Grail and the ancient knowledge the Templars were believed to have discovered. The idea of the Grail as a metaphor for enlightenment or the transmission of secret knowledge aligns with many of the Templars' own mystical beliefs, which were shaped by their time in the Holy Land and their encounters with Eastern religious traditions. As time passed, the idea of the Templars and the Holy Grail became intertwined with the broader Christian tradition of relics and the quest for spiritual purity. In medieval Europe, the Grail was increasingly seen as a divine object that could cleanse sinners, heal the sick, and grant eternal life. The Templars, as an order committed to the defense of Christianity, were viewed by some as the ideal protectors of such a powerful object. Some legends suggest that the Templars, as they moved across Europe after their expulsion from the Holy Land, brought the Grail with them to distant locations such as France, Spain, and Scotland. These locations, in turn, became the focal points of Grail myths, with places like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland being linked to the idea of hidden relics and secret knowledge associated with the Templars. Perhaps the most famous modern interpretation of the Templar Grail connection comes from Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. In this best-selling novel, the Grail is not a physical chalice, but a symbol of the sacred bloodline of Jesus Christ, with the Templars serving as the guardians of this secret. The book suggests that the Templars, as keepers of the Grail's secret, were involved in a centuries-long conspiracy to protect the true nature of Christ's divinity and the supposed descendants of Christ. While the Da Vinci Code is a work of fiction, it taps into the long-standing myth of the Templars' connection to the Grail, bringing the mystery to a global audience and sparking renewed interest in the Templar Grail legend. Despite the lack of historical evidence to support these theories, the connection between the Templars and the Holy Grail has become a cornerstone of both popular culture and alternative history. The Templars' role as protectors of the Grail continues to captivate the public's imagination, blending religious history, mystery, and adventure. The quest for the Grail, as both a literal and metaphorical pursuit, remains a symbol of humanity's desire to find divine truth, and the Templars, with their mysterious legacy, are perfectly suited to the role of guardians of this ultimate treasure. In conclusion, while the connection between the Templars and the Holy Grail is largely a product of myth, legend, and speculative fiction, the idea of their guardianship of such a powerful and mysterious object continues to be one of the most enduring aspects of the Templar legacy. Whether as protectors of sacred relics, symbols of divine knowledge, or seekers of higher truth, the Templars' association with the Grail represents an ongoing quest for spiritual enlightenment and the secrets of the divine. The Grail, in all its many forms, remains a symbol of the unknown, and the Templars, as keepers of its mystery, will continue to be at the heart of the legends and stories that seek to unravel the deepest mysteries of the past. The fall of the Knights Templar is one of the most dramatic and consequential events in medieval history, an event that reverberates through both the ecclesiastical and secular realms. The Templars, once among the most powerful and influential organizations in Christendom, were suddenly and violently dismantled by the French king, Philip IV, in the early 14th century. This fall, which led to the disbandment of the order and the arrest, torture, and execution of its leaders, has been the subject of countless historical analyses, conspiracy theories, and even legendary myths. The decline of the Templars, however, was not simply the result of a single event or the action of one man, but the culmination of a complex interplay of political, religious, and economic factors that created the perfect storm for the order's destruction. The first and perhaps most obvious factor that contributed to the fall of the Templars was their immense wealth and power. By the early 14th century, the Templars had amassed considerable wealth through their landholdings, banking operations, and donations from both the nobility and common people. Their financial clout, particularly in Europe, made them one of the most influential organizations of the Middle Ages. The Templars were not just a military order. They had become a global financial institution with extensive holdings across Christendom. This wealth, however, made them vulnerable to the envy and greed of secular rulers, particularly King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to the Templars and sought to eliminate his financial obligations. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, is often portrayed as the primary architect of the Templars' downfall. His financial troubles, exacerbated by expensive military campaigns and extravagant spending, left him with a large debt to the Templar order. In the context of medieval politics, kings and rulers often relied on the support of powerful religious or military organizations to strengthen their own authority, but they also saw these institutions as potential threats to their power. The Templars, with their vast wealth, extensive network, and independent operations, posed a challenge to the king's authority. In 1307, in an attempt to resolve his financial crisis, Philip ordered the arrest of Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, along with many of the order's members across France. The arrest was part of a larger scheme to seize the Templars' assets and eliminate their influence. Philip's political motivations were further compounded by his desire to assert his control over the Church. At the time, the papacy was based in Avignon, France, under the influence of Philip, who sought to assert his authority over both the spiritual and temporal affairs of Europe. In 1307, Philip accused the Templars of heresy, blasphemy, and immoral conduct, making these charges the justification for the mass arrests of the Templars. The accusations included charges of idol worship, secret rituals, and sexual perversion, most of which were almost certainly fabricated or exaggerated. Nonetheless, these charges provided a pretext for the king's actions, and the papacy, under Pope Clement V, reluctantly agreed to cooperate with the king's efforts to dismantle the order. The Templars were not only a religious military order, but also a formidable political entity, and their vast wealth and influence made them prime targets for rulers seeking to consolidate power. Philip IV's accusations against the Templars were part of a broader attempt to centralize power and assert control over independent institutions, including the Church itself. The king's successful manipulation of the papacy was key to the downfall of the Templars. Pope Clement V, who was heavily indebted to Philip, agreed to issue a papal bull, Pastoralis Preeminentia, in 1307, which called for the arrest of all Templar knights in Europe. The papacy's compliance with Philip's actions was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of tension between the French monarchy and the Church, which ultimately led to the papacy's subjugation under the authority of the French crown. The Templars' military role in the Crusades also contributed to their downfall. Originally established to protect Christian pilgrims on their journey to Jerusalem, the Templars had become a powerful military force with their own network of castles, strongholds, and soldiers. As the Crusades wound down in the late 13th century, however, the Templars found themselves without a clear mission. The fall of Jerusalem to Muslim forces in 1187 and the eventual end of the Crusades left the Templars without the unifying cause that had given their order purpose and legitimacy. In the absence of a military enemy, the order's wealth and military prowess, combined with its independence, made it increasingly vulnerable to the changing political landscape of Europe. Furthermore, the decline of the Crusader states and the loss of Christian territory in the Holy Land left the Templars in a difficult position. Their initial mission had been to protect the Holy Land, but after the Crusades failed to secure lasting Christian control, the Templars found themselves without a clear and pressing purpose. This loss of legitimacy in the eyes of both the Church and secular rulers weakened their standing, making them more susceptible to accusations of heresy and corruption. The Crusades, once a noble cause, had become a failed enterprise, and the Templars, who had once been seen as heroes of the Christian cause, were now perceived as relics of a bygone era. The Templars' decline also coincided with broader changes in medieval Europe. The late Middle Ages was a period of significant social, political, and religious upheaval. The rise of powerful monarchies, the increasing centralization of political power, and the gradual shift away from feudalism all contributed to a changing landscape in which the Templars' decentralized and autonomous structure seemed increasingly out of place. The Church, too, was undergoing significant reforms and challenges, particularly in the wake of the Papal Schism and the growing power of rival religious movements. The Templars, with their independent religious and political authority, were seen as increasingly incompatible with the emerging political order. The charges of heresy, which were levied against the Templars by Philip IV, were likely fueled by a mixture of political opportunism and fear. The Templars had long been the subject of suspicion due to their secrecy, their wealth, and their military prowess. Their initiation rituals, which were mysterious and secretive, made them prime targets for accusations of occult practices. The most infamous charge against them, worshipping a pagan idol known as Baphomet, was likely fabricated or exaggerated, but it helped to cement the idea of the Templars as a dangerous and subversive force. These accusations of heresy and corruption, combined with Philip's political ambitions, led to the arrest, torture, and eventual execution of the order's leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. In 1314, de Molay was burned at the stake in Paris, marking the symbolic end of the Knights Templar as an institution. The papacy, despite its initial cooperation with Philip, soon found itself caught in the political turmoil surrounding the Templars. Pope Clement V, who had been under heavy French influence, later regretted his role in the Templars' destruction, but by then, it was too late to reverse the damage. The papacy's reputation was damaged by its association with the king's actions, and many saw the destruction of the Templars as a sign of the growing power of secular rulers over the Church. The decline of the Templars marked a turning point in the relationship between the Church and the monarchy, with secular rulers increasingly asserting their authority over religious matters. In conclusion, the fall of the Knights Templar was not the result of a single factor, but the culmination of a complex web of political, religious, and economic pressures. King Philip IV of France, motivated by both financial and political considerations, manipulated the papacy to launch a campaign against the Templars, accusing them of heresy and seizing their wealth. The Templars' military role in the Crusades, their vast wealth, and their independent structure made them vulnerable to the changing political landscape of medieval Europe. The loss of legitimacy after the failure of the Crusades, the rise of powerful monarchies, and the changing nature of the Church all contributed to the Templars' downfall. The end of the order marked the beginning of a new era in European history, one in which the balance of power between secular and religious authorities would be forever altered. Despite their fall, the legacy of the Templars lives on in myth, legend, and the ongoing fascination with their mysterious history.